A Year and a Day by William Mayne. Read by Douglas Hambley. Chapter 1. Rebecca sat with her feet in the water and her head in the ground. That was what she thought she was doing. Her feet were in the sea, feeling a soft mud. The top of the water came up and down slowly on her legs, warm as it came up and cold as it went down. The rest of her was lying on some grass, and she was looking with her head upside down toward the church behind her. The tower went up very steeply into the blue sky. Something seemed to walk across her face. She put her hand to her eyes to push it away, and sat up. She kicked the sea, getting up so fast. The sea kissed the back of her knee, very wet. The thing that had crossed her face was only a horse and a cart and a man, not touching her at all, but dropping a shadow on her, and coming between her and the church, passing by on the road. The cart was full of white earth from the clay pits. Then she was alone again. There was she. Behind her was the church and its high wall. There was the road in front of it, and then the grass where she sat. There was sea today, but most days the water here was river. Now it was salt, not sweet. Beyond today's sea was the land on the Lochernach side. This side was the St. Kieran side, and the church was named for St. Kieran. Rebecca came out of the water. She had mud legs. She looked around for Sarah, but she was not here. Rebecca shouted for her, and a seagull shouted back. Rebecca crossed the road and went through the churchyard gate. All the day's hot sunshine was lying here, bright and baking and dry and heavy to walk against. The seagull shouted for Sarah. There was no reply. There was only a small scraping noise from among the gravestones. Rebecca tried to think that the noise was some skeleton rising from the ground, but the day was too hot for her mind to work. Besides, she knew what the noise was, and went toward it. "Where's Sary to?" she said, because it was her mother there among the warm stones with writing on, tending the grave of a child she once had before Sarah and Rebecca. "Sary?" said Mother. "Hereabouts she is. She came through not long since, and away do go up the hill very likely. Fetch her back to home, Becca." Becca went away. It was so bright she thought she could see with her eyes shut. She could tell she was coming near each tall stone, but that was because of the heat, not really because of her eyes. "Your legs," called Mother. Becca opened her eyes and looked at the legs. The sandy mud on them had dried into sparkling pottery, but the sparkling pottery turned to dust as she went. She came out of the churchyard and turned up the lane behind it. Here there was water running, and the ground was cold with it. The trees came up over the lane, and there was no sunshine. Becca found it dark for a step or two, and then her eyes changed, and she could see. She called again. This time the seagull did not repeat her call. Sarah did not reply either. Becca came to the end of the lane, which did not go anywhere except to some fields. A footpath went on, though, and she followed that, along the edge of a pasture with 9 cows in it. She called again, without thinking, or even listening. The cows all looked at her. One of them replied with a long, bellowing message that sounded rather stupid. Some cows will shout senseless messages. The other 8 cows looked the other way. Becca hurried on to the next stile and climbed over it. She had been coming up the hill. When she looked back, she could see all the top of the church, the stones in the yard, the inlet of the water beyond it, rough with the leaves of plants that grew there, and the land on the far side. She could see land going right out to the bay, and another headland beyond the bay, and boats on the water. The next field led up to a little wood. Sarah liked to come here and find her way around paths that only she could see. Becca came with her nearly every time, but liked to stop at the edge and think of herself being inside the woods. She liked to stay at the edge. Down by the sea, not long before, Sarah had gone walking in the water. Becca had sat down and let both feet go in, and let the feet think what it would be like to walk. She came to the edge of the trees and called. She called only softly, not to disturb anything that wasn't Sarah. "Not thee, not thee, not thee," she said, in case startled creatures had looked her way, in case she had set them running in the undergrowth or among the branches. She had disturbed something. Something began to run through the woods, coming toward her. Becca got ready to run across the field. Not thee, she said again. Then she stopped saying that because it was Sarah running toward her, trampling the wild garlic and crushing the wood sorrel. Come through the woods, she said. See what I have found. Where to? Said Becca. And what is it? She did not want to be shown a dead badger or a bone or another nest of wasps. Up by the bougie, said Sarah. Up over through. Sarah led her through the woods along the oniony path she had trodden as she came to Becca. The bougie was a small barn in a small field beyond the woods. Before they came to it, when they were only halfway across the field, Sarah stopped and went back toward the woods. We want a leaf, she said. A big leaf, but not nettle or elm, because they be stingers. She began to go back to the woods, then was too full of impatience to get to the bougie to be able to stop for a leaf. But we do need one, she said. We'll get it on the way home. Becca knew it must be a caterpillar she had found, but it was not. Sitting in a grassy tangle like a nest, all alone, was a little boy with dark hair and dark eyes and skin like milk. He seemed to be about 2 years younger than Sarah and Becca. He looked at them. They looked at him. He had no clothes on at all. Chapter 2. The boy looked at them. His face did not shake or quiver or wrinkle at all, but he cried. A tear rolled down his right cheek, along under his chin, and dropped onto his thin knee. No clothes, said Becca. Sacred. Naked, said Sarah. That's the word, like Adam and Eve. Like, but only Adam, said Becca. Where are his clothes to? He never had any, said Sarah. She meant that she thought he had never had any. Who left him here? Said Becca. I don't know that, said Sarah. But he's ours now. I'll get a leaf. Becca was puzzled by the leaf. Perhaps Sarah was not seeing a little boy at all, but what Becca had really expected, a caterpillar. Becca looked around her, trying to find this other thing, and pretending the boy was not there. What's it for? She asked. To dress him, said Sarah. We can't take him home like that. We shouldn't never hear the last of it, and we've nothing to lend. That was true. Becca was wearing an old petticoat with a top, and Sarah was wearing a petticoat skirt with an old woolen shawl for a top. Adam and Eve made aprons from fig leaves. I be a foolish maid, said Becca. Well, I see now, Sari, and I know where fig leaves grow. Why, a whole tree of them. Then she stood by the bougie, thinking of the tree, until Sarah told her the quickest way to it was by setting forth. Don't let no one have him but his mother, she said, and ran across the field toward the woods. She went around the woods, scrambling through a hedge and then through another, passing among the cows. She heard them tearing the grass as they ate it. She came into the lane, water splashing under her feet. She came on warm ground again by the churchyard gate. Here she took a sudden turn in, a leap up onto the grass, a bound onto the top of a convenient tombstone, saw no one, called, Mother, and heard no reply. She was expecting no reply. She bounced off the stone and took a long jump out into the path and went on her way. Seagulls flickered in the sky over the high tide. Becca ran around the churchyard wall in the dusty road. Hotness fell out of the sun and glared out of the wall and pushed up from the road. She came to a long garden wall, not very high, with a flat top. Heat was coming from the top stones like invisible smoke, sometimes coming just seeable in wet-looking black patches. A tree leaned out over the wall. Becca knew it for a fig tree. She came to it and stood underneath it and put her hand up to take a leaf or a handful of them. But of course the tree was much too high for her to reach, even though she had thought of herself reaching up and taking what she wanted when she was with Sarah and the boy. She had to climb the wall and stand on it. She knew that Squire Treloar would be able to see her, and that if he did, he would come out and whip her. She put her hand up to the leaves, and they were still too high, as if the tree grew taller as she got higher. She knew all at once what she was doing. She was standing on the squire's garden wall, waving her arms about. She thought that the squire might be very revengeful about that, and would lock her in the cellar and give her bread and water to eat when she was not very hungry and thirsty. And the tree was still out of reach in every direction, standing well to the garden side of the wall and making a tunnel over it. But Becca knew it was a fig tree, and that fig leaves were what Adam and Eve used, and what the boy needed. There was a noise from the house. Becca jumped outward from the wall. She still waved her arms, and her hands caught a thin branch and pulled it down with her. She fell in the road, still clinging to the little branch. The rest of the tree went up again into the air where it had been before. A small branch stayed in her hand, and the sweet smell of the bruised leaves came all around her face. She licked a finger that had been scratched and bled, and thought of food without being hungry. She found she had banged and bruised herself enough to make herself cry, even to make her walk away slowly from the tree, and still go quite slowly all the way up the lane. But she ran through the cows and hurried through the hedges until she was beyond the wood. Then she stopped and looked ahead. Everything was as she had left it. Sarah was standing guard with her arms crossed, looking severe. The boy was still sitting in his nest. He had turned a little way, and that was all. Instead of looking toward the wood, he was looking toward the bougie. "Those will be no manner of use," said Sarah, when Becca had come up with her small branch. "Adam and Eve must have been different," said Becca. "That won't make aprons," said Sarah. But it was all they had, and there was no way of making anything from a few black and green twigs and a handful of pointed leaves. They picked the boy up by his arms to make him stand and lead him. At first he would not stand, and when he did, he would not walk. But Sarah taught him to go leg after leg, and Becca tried to teach him to hold the leaves like an apron. He said nothing. He breathed gently, and that was all. He turned his head and looked at one of them, and then at the other. He let them hold his hands, and after a little while, halfway across the first field, he began to hold their hands. Becca gave him the leaves instead of her hand, because he had to learn to be dressed. They came down the lane, past the church, into the road, past the rectory, and along by the water, going quite slowly. Now and then the boy would stop walking with one foot or the other and have to be hopped along. They came to their own house and met no one on the way. Mother was in the garden, picking black currants. "Who be that?" she said, because she did not know the boy. "He be mine," said Sarah. "Ours. He's called Adam." "Adam, yes," said Becca. Sarah thought of that. "And this is his apron made of fig leaves," said Sarah. "Fig leaves?" said Mother. "Those are bay leaves. Are you going to bake him like a mackerel?" "Keep him," said Becca. "Keep him like a finding. He's ours." Chapter 3. Mother came out of the gate and stood in the road. Her feet were red from the dug earth of the garden. Her fingers were blued black by the black currants. Her face seemed as if it might be cross in the next few minutes. "Oh, mercy," she said. "What have you done with his clothes?" Instead of replying to Mother, Sarah replied to the seagull, which had come somewhere near and shouted her name. Becca thought it had shouted her name too, and she replied. So they both stood in the road outside their house, holding hands with a little stranger boy, shrieking to the sky and stealing black currants from their mother's basket. She pulled the basket away and told them to stop it. Becca took another few currants and offered them to the boy. He looked at her and did nothing. She tried to put one in his mouth, but the mouth did not open. "What else have you given him?" said Mother. "Poison berries, I'm sure." She put out a motherly hand and wiped the stain of crushed black currants from his chin. "Becca thought of his name, not me," said Sarah. "Who cares about that?" said Mother. "I do," said Sarah. "It might be the wrong name at last." "If it's not what you've called him, then it's the wrong name," said Mother. "Now tell me his right name, and we'll take him back. Where does he live to?" Sarah said he didn't live to anywhere, and Becca said he didn't live to nowhere. Mother thought they were both wrong, and that he had to live to somewhere. "To here," said Sarah. "What's your name?" said Mother. The little boy did not know he was being spoken to. Mother put out her hand and lifted his chin and repeated her question. The little boy said nothing. Becca whispered, "Adam," for him, and reminded him of why he was called that by waving the branch of bay and saying, "Apron leaves." Mother said they had better all come in out of the sun, because she could see it was beginning to scorch the boy's skin. She said that it seemed he had never been out of doors before, so pale was he. They went into the house. Sarah explained how she had gone up to the bougie, which she liked to use for her house until she got married and had one of her own. Then, coming in and out of the door, being her own visitors because Becca wasn't there, she had begun to notice the boy in his grassy nest. She wasn't sure he was there at first, and she kept looking until she was sure, but before she was quite sure, Becca had come along, and then they had seen him together, and here he was. "He still won't belong to you," said Mother. "Find him how you might. But he's no child from St. Kieran, that I know. We should by rights have him along to the rector or the squire and see what's said there. That's where they'll go when they come to find him." "We found him," said Sarah. "Me and Sari," said Becca. "Get along with ye," said Mother. "There's the question of what to do with the little mortal now, if he is a mortal." She thought the same thoughts as Sarah and Becca. If you have a little boy with no clothes on, you dress him first. She dressed him in a piece of curtain cloth that was doing nothing. Then she picked him up and held him. "He doesn't weigh more than a kitten," she said. "He wouldn't move a scales, and I don't believe he's had a thing to eat this day." She sent Sarah out to the pantry for some milk in a cup and some of the white soft middle of the bread. She tried to make the boy drink from the cup, but he did not seem to know about cups, and the milk ran down his face. "Well now, he must take something," said Mother. She dipped the soft bread in the milk and tried to put that in his mouth, but he would not open it. "I could pinch his nose and he'd be bound to open up then," she said. "But he might take that for our unkindness. Maybe he'll take heart when we take our tea. When we've had that, we must take him to the rector first and see what's to be done." "We'll play with him until then," said Becca, pulling at his arm and trying to take him from Mother. "No," said Mother. "This is a sickly child, thin as a rail like he is, and though he's waxen like a doll in a shop, that won't make him your toy, Rebecca. If you laid like this, my maid, I'd send for the rector prompt, in case you had come to your last moments. I wouldn't take you there, he'd have to come. But this is none of our boy. This is a parish boy. If he belongs to no one, he's to belong to a workhouse because he's an orphan. So you get along outside, you two, and pick all the ripe currants, and don't eat many for yourselves while I mother him a bit. He's surely needing that." Sarah grumbled while they picked currants. She felt that Mother had stolen their baby and stopped them from looking after him, which was what she wanted to do. Becca had no intention of looking after him, because she thought he was someone old enough to play with them, not just to be played with, even if he was waxen as a doll in a shop. Becca had a good hard wooden doll that Dad had made. Sarah had a cloth one, but she did not remember where it was most of the time. They picked currants. Dad came back, greased with white clay from the Lelant clay pit. He was very hot. He took a handful of the picked currants, with stalks and leaves left on, and chewed them up. He had a dark red face streaked with white clay and a purple-black mouth from the currants. He went off to swim in the sea and lose the dust and heat. "What's that? Very quiet?" he asked when he came back to the house and the boy was lying wrapped up in the curtain on the corner of the bench seat. When they told him, he touched the boy's cheek with his great hand and said, "We'll have you back with your own directly. No one's about now to pay folk to keep them that's neither got nor lost." Chapter 4. The boy did not eat with them when they had tea. They brought him to the table and put him on a stool. He perched on it rather than sat on it, with his legs under him. He looked at the food and did not smile or frown, but took nothing. "He doesn't know how to eat," said Mother. "I don't think he's ever had to." "That's a fancy," said Dad. "He didn't get that size living on kisses." "And if you kiss the boys, your teeth fall out," said Sarah. "But he's my babe, and that's another else." Since she was now eating the black currants with milk on them, the kiss she gave him left a mark like a bruise. "He hasn't lived on those neither," she said. When tea was over and the sun had dropped far down the sky so that the shadows were long and the heat of the day had gone out with the tide, They went along the road to the rectory. Mother had kept finding one more thing to do before they went, and Dad was in no hurry to knock at the door. When they got there at last and stood in the shadow of the church, all quiet, Mother and Dad were trying to make each other ring at the rectory door. Sarah thought she'd dare ring, but she could not reach the handle of the bell, and what they had come to do was give away her boy. She did nothing. At last, Dad gave the bell a tug. The door opened at once, and there was a dark, empty hall beyond. Nobody was to be seen in it. There was silence for a time. The rector's impatient voice came from the empty place and asked them what they wanted so late in the day. Then, of course, they could see that he had been standing there all the time, tall and dark, and still somehow not helpful. "We have a foundling, sir," said Mother. "Findling," said Becca. She was not sure whether she had said it aloud or not, and had to hold so tight to Mother that she got her hands slapped for pinching. "Our two little maids found this boy up to the woods," said Dad. "They'd a mind to keep him, sir, but he's a parish boy, I reckon." "And be best with ye, with yourself, sir," said Mother. The rector answered at once, a voice out of his own darkness. "Take it to the Foundling Hospital at St. Craigan tomorrow. There are no parish boys in St. Kieran. There's parish charity for him for one night." And a hand came from the dark with a coin in its fingers. "He don't eat nor cost," said Mother, because she did not want to take money. But Becca dug her right elbow into Mother's leg and with her other hand reached up and took the coin. The rectory door closed against them. "We might know he wouldn't want a boy to his house," said Dad. "I wonder who would take him with his money. You give that money here, Rebecca. Squire might have room for him, maybe." "Squire would whip him," said Becca. "I'm to be whipped, I think." "Squire don't mean harm," said Mother. "He isn't a cold body like him there." She meant the rector. "But this little mite can stay with us until we have to take him elsewhere in the morning." So they went home, and before darkness came they all went to bed. The boy was laid on the bench seat again. Then he did the first thing he had been seen to do. He sat himself up and leaned against the back of the bench seat and looked at each of them in turn. "More wakeful now," said Mother. "I wonder, would he take anything?" She tried to give him a spoonful of milk, and they thought he had swallowed some, because there was less in the spoon when she had finished. Mother said she could do no more and put the spoon on the table. It was one of the shortest nights of the year, right in the middle of summer, but there was a dark part in it. During this dark part they were all woken up by the loud cry of a seagull. It seemed as if it had got into the house, down the cold chimney perhaps, or through an open window or door. It shouted among them once, twice, and a third time, and then they were all awake and sitting up. "I'll get it out," said Dad, "though it's likely gone. Be still and I'll hear it shuffle." But he heard nothing, and they went to sleep again. The cry came again later on, clearly in the house with them. They were quicker awake this time, and there was no darkness, only the gray light of early morning. Sarah and Becca both saw clearly and heard clearly that the third cry came from the boy, who opened his mouth and called like a gull. And if he was doing it now, perhaps he was doing it before. They went to him at once. He did not look at them, but at the table, and on the table was the spoon with milk in it. That was what he wanted. Sarah brought it to him, and he let her put it to his mouth, which he opened a little way. By the cold light of beginning day, they saw him swallow that spoonful and want more. Becca went sleepily and got the jug from the pantry, and he took 2 more spoonfuls, and that was enough. Sarah thought he was cold now, so she brought her blanket and sat on the bench seat beside him to keep him warm, and slept there until the sun was up. In the morning, Janey Tregoze came to the house. She had heard 1 or 2 things, she said. She had heard how Mrs. Polwarne's 2 little maids had been seen drawing a little stranger boy along the street bravely, and he had neither jerkin nor breeches to his body, and that later they had all been seen at the rectory. Janey wanted to see the boy for herself. Mother said he was off to the Foundling Hospital before the day was out. Janey came into the house then. She had to be let in because she was a witch and had to be respected. She came and looked at the boy, who was still sitting up on the bench seat with Sarah beside him. Becca was still asleep. "'Tis what I fancied," said Janey Tregoze, as soon as she saw him. "He won't go to the Foundlings' Home. They won't have such as him. That, my dear, be a fairy child, and you should have come to me first off. What can the rector know of such things? And since you keeped him across a candle teening, why, he's here a year and a day, and then he'll be here no more one way and another. A year and a day, you remember that." Chapter 5. The Foundling Hospital at St. Craigen was a cottage in a lane by the marketplace. Several different things went on there. If there was an orphan, he was taken there. If there was a wandering person without a home or money, he or she could stay one night and move on the next day. If you were very ill and quite poor, you could come here on a Thursday and perhaps see a doctor or a chemist. If you lived nearby and hadn't enough money to last the rest of the week, you could come here and borrow some. You had to leave something valuable in exchange, like a flat iron or a watch. It was not a clean cottage. Mother could tell by the smell as they came close to it. They had walked 5 miles in the sun, and she had carried the boy the whole way. Sarah and Becca trailed after her, hot, weary, and unhappy. They did not want to lose their boy. They had to wait their turn. Inside the cottage, a local housewife was having an argument with the people who kept the place. She came out at last, hot, waving her head in triumph and saying, "I told him I'd have the best of him, and I did, and I did." And she went past on her way to tell her friends exactly how she had done it. Mother went in, and they all stood in a sour, dark passage. There was a wooden bar set across it, and that was as far as visitors went. But they could hear a baby whimpering, and no one was caring. The man wanted to know why they were there. Mother told him that the rector of St. Kieran had sent them with a foundling. Sarah leaned her head against the greasy rail and began to cry. Becca looked under it and listened to the crying in the other rooms of the children already brought here. They did not seem happy. The man asked which child it was that was the foundling. "I am," said Becca. "I be that child." She knew it would be wrong to leave the boy here. She did not know whether he was happy with them, but she knew he could not be happy here, in this bitter cottage in the shadowy town. Also, she wondered why the man had so many rusted flat irons, battered lanterns, unclean pans and skillets, shoes, cheese dishes, silver spoons, all black, magic stones, candlesticks, and other small house things. She thought they were unusual for one house, and must be there to be thrown at the orphans. So she said she was the orphan, and decided she could run away later. "That be my own," said Mother. "This is the one." And she handed the boy over the rail. The man took him and put him on the dirty floor, just the way he happened to be. Then he got out his book and started to take down particulars of what parish he had been found in, and when, and what marks there were on him, and what clothes. Becca went under the rail and sat by the boy. The man put out his foot and pushed her back to the other side again. Mother told her to get off the floor. Sarah tried to explain that if the floor wasn't good enough for Becca, then it wasn't good enough for the boy. Mother had to pretend not to hear her, and Sarah was sniffling too much to let the words be clear. The man took the boy's clothes off. Today he had been dressed in an old jersey tunic. The man gave it back to Mother and sorted in a heap of ragged clothes for something, at last giving him a stained smock and telling him to put it on. Of course the boy did not understand. The man picked him up and took him into one of the rooms, and that was all. "We've got to go now," said Mother. They went into the sunlight, and they all hated each other for being so cruel, and would not speak. Sarah and Becca carried the empty jersey tunic between them, and they started to walk home. They were all thinking of the boy's last look as he was carried away, how he had turned his head toward them, and how a silent tear had run down his cheek. But it was difficult to be sure in the gloom of the nasty den where they had left him. They walked halfway toward home, until they came to a place where the road came among the rocks of the sea, and they stopped here for a rest and to put their feet in the water and to look for magic stones. Becca had been reminded by seeing them at the Foundling Hospital. Mother took the jersey tunic from them and held it herself. There were no magic stones with their tangle of snakes. There was only the sea gushing and pouring among the rocks and pushing and pulling at the sand of the little beach here, and the gulls overhead, and their shadows on the ground. "We might set back to St. Craigan and take him out from there," said Sarah, but Mother knew she could not say yes to that. Of course, she would like a boy in the family, and before Sarah and Becca were born, there had been a baby boy who had died very soon, just living long enough for the rector to come and make him a Christian, but not long enough to be given a name. Mother knew she had to wait until her own child was born a boy, and until then she was happy with her twin maids. So they did not go back to St. Craigan, but after all, they came back with the boy, because when they had turned toward home, and the sea had dried from them, and the taste of it had been licked from their hands, they began to hear a particularly loud and repeated cry from a seagull, and another noise growing louder with the sound of the gull. The other noise was that of a two-wheeled handcart being pushed along the road, and the gull was the call of the boy, who was being brought after them. They waited until they were sure, and then they went back along the road. The cart had the boy on it, sitting on a sack, but bouncing about badly. They found his bruises later. An orphan in the hospital clothes of blue canvas pushed the cart. The boy called and called, even after Mother had picked him up and held him. The orphan boy explained that he had begun to cry like a gull as soon as he was left, and no one could do with the noise, and that they thought he wasn't Phoenician, nor Jew, nor Saracen, nor Danish, and the governor of the hospital reckoned he must be a bird, or an elf child, and he wouldn't have him in, and here he was. And when they got the child home, they found not only bruises from the cart, but marks on his back where he had been whipped. "And how I be going to explain to your dad," Mother said, was more than she could know. Becca knew she must have touched a magic stone in the sea just as she was wishing the wish she wished all morning, but she did not know which foot had done it. Chapter 6. In the days that followed his return from the Foundling Hospital, the boy grew stronger. At first he had either not been able to walk from weakness or from having never learned. He grew better at it, and soon he could run about. Mother said his legs would straighten as they were used. At first they had seemed too soft and curved, like a baby's. He became better at eating, too. One day he took the spoon from Sarah's hand and tipped it into his mouth himself. The next time he tried, though, he forgot to open his mouth, and the milk ran up his nose so that he sneezed. Dad said, when he came back that night, that there wasn't much in this world anywhere for little ones like the boy. "We'll let him bide here and see whether he goodies," was what he said at last, meaning the boy could live with them and they'd see whether he thrived. Janie Turgot's might be right, and the boy be from another underground world. "I wouldn't be astonished at that," said Mother. "He isn't fit yet to be in the sun a minute. The heat bites right through his skin." Before many days had gone by, the rector came to the door and stood there like a patch of cold and rapped against the wood with the head of his stick. It was a strange thing to do, because everyone, except Dad, was in the garden among the fruit bushes. "And my face ain't clean, nor my hands neither, and I'm not a bit fashionable enough for him," said Mother. She crawled out from the bushes, where she had been taking the last of the black currants from the shadiest places. She went to the door and bobbed a dusty curtsy. "Good afternoon," said the rector. Mother was not sure what to say next, because the rector had never been to the house before. She did another, smaller curtsy. Sarah and Becca came up behind her and held her skirt, and curtsied too, just a moment after her. The rector said nothing. He looked in his cold and unfeeling way at Sarah and then at Becca. They looked at the ground, where ants ran about under the threshold. They were too frightened to look back at this man. He stopped looking at them and looked in the garden instead. He soon saw the boy and strode across with his stick raised. Sarah thought the boy was going to be beaten, and she ran to get in the way. Becca knew the boy was going to be killed. Bang! And then she ran to hold the stick. Mother knew what they were both thinking, and that they were wrong. She caught them both and sat them down among the growing onions. The rector, of course, did what he was going to do with the stick. He merely lifted aside an overhanging raspberry cane and looked at the boy, who was sitting in a patch of weedy ground, with nothing on as usual, because clothes seemed to fall off him, and eating black currants. Now he would eat what he was given. "Is this the Foundling?" said the rector. "Yes, sir," said Mother. Sarah and Becca crawled out of the onions and edged their way around the rector and Mother and sat beside the boy. "Why is he not at the hospital in St. Craigan?" said the rector. "I understood you would take him there on the morning following your visit to the rectory." "They wouldn't take him in," said Mother. "They sent him back directly. They wouldn't let him bide." "I gave you the money belonging to the hospital," said the rector. "But when I was there yesterday, I found that no boy had been delivered to them, and nothing was written in their book about him. What you do with the boy is no concern of mine, but you are to return the money to me, which you obtained under false pretenses." "Now, that isn't so at all," said Mother. "'Twas in no way like that. What they write in their book I can't read, but I saw them do it. I know how it looks when 'tis being made. I've seen the writing being laid on the page, so I know they wrote, and my 2 little maids here can tell you the same." Mother was getting angry now. She was not going to be frightened of someone who called her a liar. Sarah and Becca were angry at the same time. "I know writing," said Sarah. She meant she had seen it being done, like Mother. She had not been to school because there was no school, and she could not read or write or do sums. "We left him there," said Becca. "Sarah cried. 'He's my boy,' said Sarah. 'Then they sent him after us in a cart.'" Becca said that it was true, 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 and she threw a very small pebble about halfway toward the rector's right boot. That served him right, she thought. By now, Mother had started to speak again, even though the rector was trying to say something. Mother raised her voice and began to tell anyone who was listening that she wasn't one to be dishonest. It was not dishonest to be poor, or to be a humble person without any learning, and she knew the truth as well as anyone. At the same time, Sarah and Becca were explaining just as loudly how the Foundling Hospital smelled sour and how they had been caught up with at the beach by the foundling with the cart. When they had finished, they were standing up on either side of the boy and glaring at the rector, and Mother went on to say how humility was for the humble, and position and rank was for the gentlefolk, and learning for the clergy, but manners were for the mannerly, and that was all people. But by then the rector had turned away, very stiff and bleak, and walked off down the garden path. Mother and Sarah and Becca stopped speaking and looked at each other, and they all thought what a terrible thing they had done, to speak to the rector as they had, and they wondered what there was to say next. Mother gathered up her apron and ran down the path. Sarah and Becca could hear her explaining in a trembling voice how the hospital had sent the boy back because they thought he was a bird or an elf child. The rector paused a moment, and Sarah opened the gate for him and dropped a last curtsy. "Superstitious nonsense," said the rector, and went through the gate. From among the fruit bushes came the last remark to him. The boy, excited by the way the others had shouted, had his own shout. No one knew what he said, but he gave a long, careful cry in seagull language. "Into the house," said Mother. "I've to laugh or die, and out here 'tisn't suitable." Chapter 7. "If it's going to be nothing but trouble," said Dad, "then maybe we should find another home for him, or even put him back in that pook of hay by the bowgee where you found him." Dad was worried because they had told him about the rector's visit. Mother was very sorry now for the way she had talked loudly to him, and she was not sure what she had said. Sarah and Becca felt excited at the thought of a big trouble between their family and the rector. Their excitement had made them too brave. Now they were sitting on the bench seat with the boy, wondering when they would be getting supper. Dad kept saying he would have to go down to the rectory before he had his supper, and then he did not go and did not go. "Maybe rector would be content if I said we wouldn't keep the little chap," he said. "No one will want 3 of us," said Sarah. "And he shan't go without us, shall he?" And she gave the boy a hug to show him who was Mother. He was pleased with that and gave a small cry, like a gull, which seemed to be his word for Sarah. Then he turned his head to Becca and said what he had begun to call her, a word in blackbird language. Becca was not being motherly. She was trying to teach him a cat's cradle with a length of wool. "I'll tell the rector to come for the 3, said Dad. "He can have you 1 and all." There'll be a marvelous amount of room down in that old house, share and share alike with the ghosts, and worse than ghosts, I shouldn't wonder. Now I'll be off and back before true darkness, or I may run against some such folk myself." He took the very same coin that the rector had given them a few days before and went off with it. While the others sat at home, hugging the little boy or teaching him games, or like Mother, boiling fresh little potatoes out of the garden, he went to the rectory. He came back before the potatoes were boiled, with the same coin again, which the rector would not take back. They were frightened of him, but he was a kind man, and frightened of other people himself. He was happiest when he was talking in church to God. As well as the money, he had sent back a pair of shoes. They fitted well onto the boy, so now he had them and the jersey tunic. The tunic did not stay on very well, and the shoes would not stay on at all, in spite of their good fit. "I wonder why he sent them," said Mother. "Shoes of all things." "We never wear shoes but for one time and place," said Sarah. "For going to church services. So rector means we have to take him to church." "I suppose we will, however it was," said Mother. "If he had no shoes, I could carry him, but folk will look so at him." The boy was known about before he was taken to church. People would come walking by and stop in front of the house, gazing into the garden. Janey Tregoze came again. She did not stop outside in the road, but came through the gate and found them all in the house. They let her in because of the way she was a witch. Mother was glad to see her. Somebody had to give her advice, and Janey was easier to get on with than the rector was. The squire was the other person she might have turned to, but she did not think he had anything to tell her. "So they wouldn't let un be a foundling," says Janey. "You might have saved your walk, for I telled ye how 'twould be." "Well, what did they say? That they wouldn't house him?" "Some old creed," said Mother. "That he wasn't Danish, nor Phoenician, nor Jewish, nor Saracen, and might be a bird child or an elf." "If he grows wings, then he be one of they two," said Janey. "But I put un down to be a fairy child after all that. See, he ain't Danish, for he don't look like any of the Danes in the duchy. He ain't Phoenician, for they have a different set of the eye. He ain't Jewish, for all the Jews escaped their slavery long since. And he ain't Saracen, for he don't have that blue hair. And he ain't a bird. I do believe they made that up down at the hospital. I never heard of such. No, he's a pure fairy child, and they put him out for their own reasons, and they've done it at other times too. So I know how it is with them, and 'tis always so. He'll be here a year and a day, no more, a year and a day, and then you'll find what you shall find." "Rich gold," said Sarah, who had been listening as hard as possible. "A frog," said Becca, who was listening too, but thinking of some different story. "No, none of that," said Janey. But then she closed her mouth and said no more. She went from the house and hurried away toward her home. "What happens when 'tis a year and a day?" Sarah asked Mother. "Oh, nothing, I don't suppose," said Mother. "She didn't say out, did she?" "No," said Sarah. "But is it good or bad?" "You must ask Janey Tregoze," said Mother, and Sarah knew she could never find out now, because she would not dare ask Janey. A visitor the next day was the squire. Sarah and Becca thought him too young to be so important. He walked into the house without asking or being asked. The house belonged to him, and so did many more in the village, but it was still someone else's private dwelling. "Well enough," said Mother. "Don't knock too hard, Master Edward, or there'll be a hole in that poor door." "I say I never touched it, I declare," said the squire. "I just looked in to see the boy that there's all the fuss about. I never saw a fairy child before. Do you suppose it's true what Janey Tregoze says, that that's what he is? Is that him?" The squire's little terrier dog came in after him and began to look around the floor. The boy barked at it, and it went out. "That's clever," said the squire. "That's deuced clever. Janey says he won't have time to learn English, or Cornish, nothing human, you know. Is it true what she says, that he'll only live a year and a day from when you found him? Not really worth learning the language, is it?" Chapter 8. The squire's visit made no one happy, but it did not make anyone quite sad either, because Sarah decided to say nothing about it to anyone else, even herself, and Becca decided that she had not heard what the squire said. "Master Edward don't mean no harm at all. said Mother. "He be a great elf himself, and can't help it, and we be the ones to put up with it, for that be the order of nature. Say tree, say house, say cat," said Becca, teaching the boy to speak. "Say Isaac, no 'tis Adam, say Adam. Say Sari," said Sarah. "Say mother." The boy opened his mouth without looking happy, and made the little laugh that Mother often made. So he knew what Mother meant, and that was his name for her, his word. On Sunday morning they went to church. Now all the people came to look at the boy. Some came again because they had already been to the house. Some came for the first time because they were too proud or too polite to come to the cottage by the water. So on the way to the church there were faces and eyes looking their way. Dad was the first to notice. He always felt when he was being watched. When he had worked at the tin mines underground, he had felt the ghosts watching him and heard them knocking on the walls of the mine. That was why he left the mines, because of being always watched, and worked now in the open at the clay pits. So today he noticed the eyes watching, and then he saw the faces turn toward them. He began to whistle quietly, until he thought it was not right to whistle on a Sunday on the way to church. He stopped whistling and began to click his tongue and hum a tune. But he had to stop that too, because the only tune he could remember was not a hymn tune, which would have been all right, but one of the Leyland dances, which wouldn't do at all. So he began to get cross with everybody, telling Mother to step on a little faster, and making Becca stop her skipping along and walk more like a crow than a blackbird. "He calls me Blackbird," said Becca, holding up the boy's hand. The boy looked up from where he was walking between the two girls, and said the piece of Blackbird's song that was Becca's name. And then he said Sarah's name in Gull language, and Mother's name in a laugh, and looked at Dad. He opened his mouth very wide, and made the sound of a great and noisy yawn. "Tired already, then?" said Dad. "We can go back home and be not so much looked on." But the boy was not tired. He was only imitating Dad's yawn and making a name out of it. Sarah and Becca knew at once, and started to laugh and lean on each other and pull on Dad's coat. The boy began to look very pleased and started to shout like a gull and make all his other naming noises to please them. It all happened in the middle of the village street, and people who had stopped looking at the boy and gone on toward church turned around and looked again. "Well," said Dad, "I don't care for it at all like this." Mother picked the boy up and walked on. The boy knew there was to be no more shouting. Sarah and Becca stopped roaring in a moment when Dad told them to, and they were all quiet by the time they got to church. They sat at the back so that no one could watch, but of course faces kept turning to them because the boy wanted to join in with the music. There was no organ. The squire had often said that there should be an organ, but there still was only Mr. Hawking playing a violin, and 3 more men with an oboe, a clarinet, and a curling gaspy thing called a serpent. The boy kept making the strange sounds of these old instruments. He did not have tunes, only sounds, and that made the band go wrong, so that it too forgot its tunes and had only sounds. At last, at the end of the psalms, there was another new sound in the church, and that was the young squire laughing in his pew, and his dog jumping up and barking and licking his face. The rector came to read a lesson then, and looked at everyone very dark and coldly, so that there was quiet. The boy was quiet, except that he had dropped one of his shoes off, and it bumped down to the floor. Everybody heard the squire rattle the window open, because he had a window and a fireplace in his pew, and drop the dog outside, where it went down with a yelp. Everybody heard it pad into church a minute later, as the rector was reading, and scrape the pew door open. After that, Sarah and Becca got down among the pews and played quietly with the boy, so that he did not notice the band and make his noises. Mother thought the rector would be pleased with the way they were keeping him quiet all through the next singing and the next piece of talking, so she was very startled when the rector came slowly down the church toward the door, and then past the door, and right up to where she and Dad were sitting. And there he stopped. Mother put down a hand and brought Sarah and Becca up, and the boy, from the floor where they had been sitting, and they all looked at the rector, wondering how wicked they had all been for him to come to them in the middle of the service. But he was not angered by anything. He beckoned to the boy, and Mother handed him a cross. The rector picked him up and took him toward the church door, and then to the font, which is a large basin with water where babies are baptized. "Where are the godparents?" the rector asked when he was there, and Mother and Dad and the girls followed him. Mother said she hadn't reckoned nor thought about such, no, and Dad shook his head and still couldn't bring anything to mind but a Lelant dance tune. The rector said that they could be godparents, because they were not real ones after all, and then the squire stepped out, with his dog in his arms, and said he would be one too. Ha, what? Then the boy was baptized, christened Adam, and everything went well, in spite of his attempts to drink most of the holy water. "Now he's a holy Christian man," said Sarah, leading him back to the pew. The holy Christian man kicked off his shoes and made clarinet noises for the rest of the service. Chapter 9. One day the summer was over. The land stopped being dry and hot and became wet, muddy, and tepid. A soft, warm wind began to lie across the country, pulling at the leaves on the trees and painting the sky white, gray, and sometimes black during the day, and making it red night and morning. The sea rose up with the wind and filled the river in front of the house, and waves would scratch the shore and spill onto the road, and the fishing boats came right up the river to rest on the mud, away from the stone quays of the harbor. Sarah looked at their boy Adam when they were in the house one afternoon and the rain was stiff as a broom outside. She saw how he had changed since she had found him. Then he had been small and pale and yellowy, nearly the same color as the jersey tunic. Now he was dark with the sun that had been on him, and the jersey tunic was still just about the color of the sheep the wool had come from. When he was first with them, he could hardly walk, partly from not knowing how, and partly from not being strong. Now he could walk all day and run as he liked, and jump heavily or lightly, whichever he chose, and he was strong. He had learned some words, that is, he understood them. Dad said he was like a dog, knowing what its master said, and like a dog he could not say them himself. He could follow a lot of what was said, but all he could say was sounds. He seemed to be able to make any sound he heard, whether it was cloth being shaken, or a spade digging the earth, or a fly in the next room buzzing at the window. He was sensible with what he understood and with what he could say in sounds. Becca could talk with him for a long time without getting cross, because if he stopped his sort of talking, she went and did other things. Sarah was often angry with him for not understanding, but that was because she loved him so much and wanted him to love her. If he really did love her, then he would understand her, she thought, and she would understand him. So she was sometimes impatient. But Becca did not care so much, and she was not offended if he talked about something else instead of what she was talking about. There were times when Adam grew angry with them for talking to him too much. They used to wonder why he covered his eyes, and they thought they must hurt him, but he was doing it so that he would not hear them. It took him some time to find out that he ought to cover his ears. Usually that was enough for him, to get where he could not hear them. That would make Sarah cross too, and she would cry, and Becca would wonder what she had done wrong to send them both away. Covering his ears was not always enough for him. Becca was patient enough to find what came next, but Sarah had always gone away, and she never saw the next thing. The boy wanted to go away from people and talk to things. Becca had seen him once uncover his ears and talk to a caterpillar on a leaf. He seemed to listen to it, and to touch it with his fingers, and open his mouth to speak to it. But Becca never heard a sound from either of them. But she knew he could hear sounds that were not there, and Sarah knew it too. He would sit in the garden and point to a corner of it, and make a sound they could not hear, and it was the sound of a spider far off on the fence, or a lizard sunning on a stone. From a long way off he could hear Janey Trago's, and there was a silent sound for her too, not any of her words, which there were plenty of, but something else. Janey said he could hear her rheumatic joints creaking better than she could, But though Sarah and Becca looked into his mouth and saw his tongue and his throat move, they could not tell what sound he made. At church he learned the tunes of the band and followed one instrument or another, often at the same time, and just as often a little later. But that was not much worse than some of the bad singers there already, so no one minded. The rector minded when he imitated the closing of the Bible during the service, but all the rector could do about it was close the Bible more quietly. All the congregation minded one day when the boy heard something high up in the vault of the roof and spoke a very small sound that Sarah and Becca could just hear. Out from the rafters flew a cloud of bats, and there were real shrieks from women and answering shrieks from the boy, and a strong, fierce silence from the rector, and laughter and barking from the squire's pew. Mother put 2 hands over her head at first, and then she knew who had caused it all, and put the 2 hands down to haul up the jersey tunic and give the boy a hard slap on his bare bottom. That stopped his shrieks answering the women, and his cries to the bats. At times, on a rainy, windy day, they would not be able to find him in the house. His tunic would be there, and that often happened because clothes slid off him. But he would be missing. He liked to go out in the rain with nothing on. Sarah and Becca would not have done such a thing themselves, but with the boy it did not seem to matter much. He would come back later on when the day was growing dark, wet and warm and content. Becca followed him one day, hoping he would stop and play in a dry place under a hedge, but he did not. He walked on in the rain and wind and seemed comfortable. She followed after him, and her clothes became soaked and stuck to her, and her hair grew thin, and the wind turned her hands blue. She followed and watched, and the boy went up the hill to the highest place among the furze bushes where Janey Tregoze let her goats wander, and there he stood and talked to the sky and the weather, and listened through the wind to the sea, and looked and searched the wild air. Becca crouched herself under the furze and was cold. She heard him answering the wind, and she heard him call out sounds more like words than anything she had heard him make before. But no one answered him, and Becca thought it might be because she was there, especially when he came home this time unhappy and restless, pacing about the house all the evening and the night. Chapter 10. One day in the autumn, Janey Tregoze came to the house in the morning. It was a rainy day, and Janey had folded a sack on itself and wore it like a hood on her head, and looked certainly like a witch. Sarah and Becca had been playing in the house, with the boy watching from his couch, not yet got up. Mother had just shouted at the girls for making such a cow's dance of their game, and getting in her way, when Janey put her head around the door. "See," said Mother, "they hear you up in the town." Janey laughed her frightening laugh at that. Sarah and Becca stopped talking and shouting and stood still. Adam did a little laugh of his own, copying Janey. "No," said Janey, "there be another noise about over to the harbor." "What be that then?" said Mother. She did not really want to stop her housework to hear new gossip. She took her scrubbing brush, which she was going to use on the floor, and still held it in her hand, ready for work. "Fish be readying," said Janey, "so there's cause to go down." She meant that the season's sardines had been caught, and it was time to buy some and salt them down to eat in winter. "Yes," said Mother, "I have my fish money put by, but soonest isn't cheapest, Janey. Or what sort of year is it?" Janey always knew whether it would be a good year for fish. Witches knew that sort of thing. "There be them that can tell ye, my dear," she said. She meant that she would tell for 6pence, because that was how she got her money. She told every year. Mother found her 6-penny piece, and Janey put it away in a pocket under the wet sack. Water dripped from the sack onto the floor. "This year," said Janey, "buy your fish soon. So be down today for the first sardines. 'Tis the right time. But for friendship, my dear, I tell you another thing. There be a Saracen captain down there that lost a boy ashore down along the coast near the middle of summer, and now he comes again asking for him." "What sort of boy, did they say?" said Mother. Now she put down the scrubbing brush and dried her hands on her apron. "A Saracen boy," said Janey, "that never spoke no Cornish nor English neither, just the Saracen language." Then she knotted her sack and her head inside it, and closed the door, and went away to her next visit and her next message about fish and her next sixpenny piece. Mother and the girls and Adam went down at once to the harbor, where the sea came leaping gray and white against one side of the quay, and was quiet and gray and gently licking against the other. Part way down the quay, where the wind began to catch people by the arms and legs and try to lift them away into the calm harbor, stood the fish boxes. They were deep and square, with their wooden lids standing beside them on one side. On the other were great silver heaps of small fish, freshly come out of the sea, lying like separate drops of pearly liquid under the cloudy sky, and now and then one of the drops would twitch and bend and come sliding down the heap like a real drop running back to the water. Men and women were picking the fish up, rubbing them with gray salt and putting them one at a time into the boxes. Mother and the children had to come here to buy, and they had to go past as well, because beyond the boxes, beyond the fishing boats, there was the Saracen boat with its strange sail tied up in the harbor. On top of it there sat a tall, big, black-bearded Saracen, like a pirate, with gold rings in his ears and a cloth wound around his head, watching and waiting and taking no notice of the rain. Beside his boat there were sacks on the quay, some of them open. From the open ones there had rolled great heaps of shining green fruit, glistening like fish. People from the villages were here too, looking at the fruit and making up their minds whether to buy. Now and then one of them would talk to the Saracen captain, and he would talk back, waving his hands and smiling and showing his white teeth. Then, when he had spoken, he would sit still again, and the people would go back to looking at the fruit and talking quietly to each other. Mother stopped at the fish boxes. She picked up Adam and let him look over into them. Sarah and Rebecca climbed up the sides, slippery with scales and gritty with salt, and looked for themselves. In the boxes, the fish were being packed head and tail, layer after layer, level after level. Each fish was rubbed with salt, and when they had filled one layer, more salt was put between them and on them. The men and women doing the work went about it quietly so that they would get it done sooner. They did not speak. The only sounds down here on the quay were the sea beating against the stones, the fishing boats rubbing against them on the other side, the grating noise made by the rough salt, and the gulls overhead. The gulls were noisy and came quite close, hoping to steal a fish from the heap, crying and calling. Becca and Sarah expected Adam to call back to them, but he had heard another noise and began to make that instead. Becca and Sarah listened to this new small noise. Mother put him down between them, and they held him against the side of the box, and they all looked in. Mother went across to the nearest boat, where more baskets of fish were being filled and brought to the heap, and began to ask about fish. Becca and Sarah listened to Adam. At last they heard what he heard. Down in the box, the fish were talking and singing, although they were dead and salted. The noise they made was not an unhappy one. They were exchanging gentle remarks with one another, and Adam was joining in. "Listen," said Becca to the people filling the box, because they did not seem to have heard. "Listen." "Ah, my dear," said a man, pausing a moment and smiling at her. "The little fishes be asking for more, that they be. More, they be calling, and there be more to come out of the sea when the weather blows right." And then they could hear that the fish were calling for more to come to the box and be salted and live close and comfortable. Mother came back from her buying and took Adam up again into her arms. "Now we'll see," she said, "whether this little fellow's home has sailed back to him." And she turned to go on down the quay to the Saracen's boat tied up there, with the Saracen sitting on top of it. Chapter 11. The Saracen's boat was bigger than a fishing boat. It had a deck all the way along and a cabin coming up out of it. The Saracen sat on the cabin, cross-legged, watching his heaps of green fruit on the quay. Now and then he pulled at the mustache part of his beard. Mother came up to the side of the boat and then waited. She waited for one of the fruit buyers to finish talking with the Saracen captain. They were talking about money. The buyer was saying little numbers, and the Saracen was saying big ones, But the buyers' numbers got bigger, and the Saracens got smaller, until at last both of them were saying the same number. Then there was a getting out of purses and an exchange of money. The man buying fruit went back and took up 2 sacks and carried them off. The Saracen put away his purse, with much more fuss and much more hiding than Janey Turgot's with her 6-penny piece. The Saracen's clothes smelled deeply of gingerbread. Janey Turgot's smelled of sacks in the rain and goats. Sarah smelled the Saracen, and Becca remembered Janey. Adam remembered the fish calling for more and made their noise. Mother started to talk to the Saracen, holding Adam up for him to see. Sarah and Becca were not listening at first, but then they did begin to listen and started to tug at Mother's skirt. She was asking the Saracen whether Adam was his boy, whether he had been lost from the boat, and whether the Saracen would take him back. The Saracen captain did not understand at all. He thought Mother was trying to buy his fruit and kept pointing to it and saying, 5 shilling, 5 shilling, my good price, cheap the best. Mother said again, Excuse me, sir, but 'tis said that this boy might be your boy that was lost ashore in the summer. Sarah and Becca pulled at her, but quietly because they were both much more frightened of the Saracen than they were of the rector or the squire or Janey Turgot's. Stop that, Sarah, said Mother, when both of them had got beyond pulling and were actually pinching her through her clothes. This is where he belongs, maybe. If you were lost, you would like to be brought home again. She put the boy up on the edge of the boat and held him so that he stood. Adam did not care for that, and called his seagull cry for Sarah and his blackbird call for Becca, so they went to him and held him with Mother. The Saracen stood up then, in his long coat and baggy trousers. There was a dry patch on the cabin top where he had been sitting during the rain. He walked down onto the deck and went into the cabin. They could hear him talking down there. Then he came up again and sat on the cabin once more. The boat started to rock on the water. Adam did not like the movement and lifted his legs both up from the rail. All 3 of them held him up in the air. The boat went on rocking, and then there came up from the cabin a very large and fat Saracen lady. Every time she moved, the boat pitched gently from side to side and end to end. The fruit buyers on the quay had begun to come around to see what was going on. The men and women salting the fish had begun to look and dust the salt from their hands and wonder about coming closer. The huge Saracen lady came to the side of the cabin and looked at everybody. The boat heeled over a little, and the captain had to lean back a little to stay upright. The Saracen lady looked at Sarah, then at Adam, and then at Becca. Then she spoke to her husband. He waved his hands in the air, and he meant he did not care and was not interested in what happened. The Saracen lady looked at all 3 children again, and then put out an arm like a pillow and a hand like a cushion, and took hold of Becca's tiny arm and began to lift her onto the boat. 2 pound, she said. Good lady slave, do work. Man give you oranges too. No, said Mother, taking hold of Becca's other arm and letting go of Adam. No, said the Saracen lady. 2 pound and more shilling, and she pulled at Becca again. By now the fish salters had come to see what was happening and joined the crowd. Others were coming from the landward end of the quay. About 12 people stood around Mother and the children. Some of them saw that the Saracen lady was mistakenly trying to buy Becca. Some thought the Saracen lady was stealing her, and some thought that Mother had come down there to sell her children. They all started to talk about it. Some of them were pleased with what they thought was happening, and some were indignant and thought it a shame, and there began to be a commotion. The Saracen lady let go of Becca and took herself off into the cabin again, and Mother was left to turn around and face the crowd. The Saracen captain did nothing but sit there until 1 or 2 in the crowd began to throw his own fruit at him. Mother shouted, "No, no," because she understood what was happening. The captain jumped off the cabin top, pulled out a sword, and leaped onto the quay. He was only defending his own property. Then everything was suddenly calm again because the next people to come running up were the harbor master and one of the fishing boat owners. Between them, they sent the fish salters to their work again, and the fruit buyers right off the quay. The captain put his sword away and climbed back to his cabin top. Mother hastily explained exactly what had happened and how it had come about. The harbor master said he had heard of that boy, and which one was it of the three? Then he turned to the Saracen captain and talked to him in a language he could understand. From down inside the boat, the Saracen lady joined in the talk. She was very cross at first, but she grew calmer, and at last she laughed and put her enormous face out of the cabin door and smiled at them all. £2 plenty shilling, she said, and went in again and could be heard laughing enormously and shaking the boat. Chapter 12. Mother's order of fish came to the house just before dark. When Dad came home, she was in the back room with the fish and the streaming salt, packing them down into a box by candlelight. Dad came in looking for her, looking salty himself from the white clay of the pit. "'Tis a droll story I've heard," he said. "Selling the children down at the fish quay to some old pirate of a fellow from Barbary or Turkey." But he knew that no one had been sold because he had seen both girls and Adam as he came in through the house. He chose himself 3 fish for his tea and took a taste of salt on a finger end. "Whatever you heard," said Mother crossly, taking the fish away from him and salting them down firmly. "You don't need me to tell you the right way round of it. You can reckon out what it must have been." "There now," said Dad. "I see 'twas worse for you than I knew. I'll build up the fire and wash and set the kettle on." "You would be upset too," said Mother. "'Twas a proper dance that started up, led off by folks that know better than any that I wouldn't offer to sell my own child. No, nor no other child neither, whether poor or not. 'Tisn't as if I want to part with that little fellow in there either, if he is strange. But 'tisn't right to keep him if he belongs some way to another person. However, he didn't belong seemingly, and that was that, nearly, if it wasn't for them offering up to take Becca for a slave. Well, maybe 'twasn't so very bad when 'tis gone through as 'twas, but just looking back, it seems a terrible skirmish. The harbour master came along, and he could talk to this Saracen, and the last of it was, 'twas considered very droll by everyone, but they'll all mock us for a while, and then no more. Yet it won't do for you to tease me in my own home, with my ears singing from the talk of it up and down the town." Dad came out of the back room without his fish. Becca came and gave him a hug to see what he thought about selling her off to a shipman as a slave. "You'm still to home, little maid," he said. "Where else could you be?" Becca sat down again by the fire, feeling safe again, and took Adam on her knee to make him safe too. Sarah went with Dad for coals for the fire, and then poured the kettle out for him to wash at the table. When Mother came out from the back room and the fish were salted down in their box, she washed too, and hung a row of fish before the fire to cook, with bread on the fender below to catch the salty juices. She lit the lamp, set the table, made the tea, put Adam at the table, and was cross with Sarah for having black coal dust on her, and with Becca for having white clay streaks on her. But when she had brought the fish up from the fire and picked hers to pieces and left only the bones and the heads, she was in a happy state again, and pleased with everyone. She took Adam on her knee to make sure she was treating him equally with the others, and made him smile and smile until he sang like a flock of gulls. When she put him down to sleep on the bench seat, he sat up, as he always did, and picked out noises from around about, the hissing of the kettle, the running of the rain on the slates of the house, the rustling of clean clothes that Mother folded and ironed, and now and then sounds that no one else had heard, of a distant animal out in the cold wet rain, or the newly salted fish in the back room calling for more, or the church clock far out of ordinary hearing in the wind and distance, sending out its hours. Adam was happy that night, and Mother thought it was because he knew he had a home with them now, even though she knew he could not really understand what had happened to him, or how he really should go back to the person he came from. He was happy that night, but restless. In the morning, Mother found him trying to open the door and be outside, though it was so wet and cold. In the days that followed, he stayed restless and began to seem not quite so happy. He would listen and hear everything, and answer the sounds he heard by making them again, more and more quietly. He seemed to be listening for something else, something far away. Sometimes he would seem to hear and stand in the middle of the room or the road or wherever he was, with ears and eyes and mouth open and tense, with his hands ready to hold what he wanted to hear, and he would not hear it. He would become limp and small, and tears would come to his eyes. He would go away in the daytime, climbing the hill alone in his jersey tunic, and come back with it wet with rain and dew, and his own limbs like pale wax, trying to say in his own way what he had heard. His talking then would be of sounds they all knew, of animals and the sea and the sky, but they all knew that these were not the things he was trying to tell them of. "If he could speak to us, and we could speak to him," said Sarah, "we could tell him where he has to go to listen." "'Tis the church bells," said Becca. "'Twas so on Sunday," said Sarah. On Sunday the bells had rung out for the season called Advent, and Adam had listened and sung with them, and been almost happy. But as he went on listening, he still did not find what he wanted, and became silent once more. The bells rang at Christmas again, and this time he went to the foot of the tower and laid his head against the stones to listen, and was standing there in the frost as the people went into the church. It was Janey Trego's who found him as she passed by, because she did not go to church. She wrapped him in her sack and went down through the village with her hair flying out, and brought him to the house and waited for the family to come from church. Dad was home first, because he had been looking for Adam, and the end of it was that the Polwarn family had a witch at their Christmas dinner, because they could do nothing but invite Janey to stay. And Dad had to go to the rector the next day and explain why he had not been at church. The rector shook his head and said that the boy should be at a foundling home. The squire, who was there too, gave Dad a shilling, because, he said, the boy was a curiosity, what? And his own godchild. Chapter 13. The first day of the year there was snow on the ground. Becca said she had never seen it before, looking from the window, but she had forgotten, said Sarah, who was the same age and could remember it when she was small. "I know snow," said Sarah, and she opened the door and ran out into it, catching the falling islands of it in the air. She did not get to the gate. Halfway down the path she slipped and went down on her face across the stones at the edge of the garden, and lay there hurt among the green leaves of the cabbages. She picked herself up, came in, and said she did not know that snow, and it was not like before. Adam sat on his bench seat, where he had been all night, and looked silently at the girls as they examined the red bruises and scratches. He was silent now in the morning, and all night too. It was not until the middle of the day that he would stir in these cold times, and then he would take some milk and come by the fire, or stand in the door or outside in the rain. He had not gone from the garden for a week now, neither had he said very much. The gifts he had had for Christmas, which were shoes for winter and a pair of breeches with a silver button at each knee and a slate for him to draw on, lay on the bench, and he did not seem to know that they were his. The snow stopped falling. Sarah went out more carefully and tried to scrape up a snowball. Mother said that snow for that was rare here, but that she had walked knee-deep when she was a child up on the moors. When the snow clouds went, the sun came out bright and hot and began to turn the snow to steam. There was a little mist from that over the land, but over the water in front of the house the air was clear and still, and sounds came for miles from the white cloud that was the land on the Lochernach side. Adam began to hear from inside the house. He came out. He was interested in the snow and tasted it. He was more interested in what he could hear from all about him. He became full of sounds again, quiet sounds that must be real, but that Sarah and Becca could not hear. One sound that was real but could not be heard was the church clock, not the ringing of its bell, but the ticking of it, half a mile away, and to hear Adam repeating its sound was like being in the church under the tower. When the bells rang for 1/2 the hour, he covered his ears, because the great sound was terrible to him. These ordinary sounds interested him, but did not make him excited. He was trying to find something in the air, but it was not to be heard. He stood by a gate and conversed with the day. Sarah and Becca went in when they were cold, and then went out again to bring in wood from the edge of the trees on the hill. From here they heard something that interested them. There was a sound over the water in the distant fluffy whiteness. There was a clear shout, so that they looked at the water for a boat coming up. Then there was a distant gobbling yelping far off on the Lochernach side. That made the girls stand and listen because it was so ghostly and unearthly. They waited for it to come nearer and be upon them, and held hands under the small trees in case it did. The sound stayed its distance, however, and they became used to it and went on gathering wood. When they looked up again, the mist had lifted from the other side, and they saw the land looking as if it had been rubbed with salt like a sardine, with the snow lying in every shallow hollow and by every bank and hedge. Across the marked fields they saw the hounds of the fox hunt running in a wedge, calling as they went. Behind them came the men on horses, and one of them blew on a horn and sent a wild cry from the green and white land to the blue sky. The hunt came down to the water's edge. Sarah and Becca watched in the hope of seeing an excitement like the fox swimming and the hounds after it. From the way the hounds seemed to glide over the fields, it was likely, they thought, that they would run over the water and not have to swim at all. But the fox turned inland again and crossed the track of the hunt and went up the estuary, and the hunt followed until it was out of sight and sound. Mother, down in the house, heard nothing of it. She came out and called them in for their dinners. When they went down, there was no sign of Adam. "I thought he was talking to you," said Mother. "But I suppose he wouldn't be if you were up there in the wood, loitering and not getting so much wood either. Well, he'll have to come back when he does. I can't run around to him the whole time." After their soup and bread, the girls went out to find him. They thought they could follow his tracks, like a hound. Sarah thought they watched the footprints. Becca said they followed the sound, but Mother said they followed the scent. But to find Adam, they followed their guesses, going around the places where he had been before, and they did not come upon him, and he did not answer their calls. When it came to darkness, Mother did not know what to do. Not only had Adam been out a long time on a cold day, but now they could not find him on a colder night, with no way of seeing him. Dad came in and said he must have his tea first, and then he would be going back to the village to ask there. He was quickly drinking a second mug from the pot when the door opened, and in came the squire's little terrier dog, and looked around the floor, not at anybody there. The squire followed after him, and he was carrying Adam. "Deuce strange little fellow this, Polwarne, Mrs. Polwarne," he said. "Following a fox up by Lelant this afternoon when I came across him in the marshes. Got myself soused pulling him out. Lucky to be alive, the little fellow, I mean." Mother made exclamations of, "Oh, well," and "Mercy," and "Well, you shouldn't, sir," when she saw how the squire's hunting coat was so muddy and greened with marsh slime. "Following the huntsman he was," said the squire. "Had a devil of a ride to catch up again. Kept the little fellow on the saddle with me. No end of exercise, what? Seemed a bit disappointed at the end, though. Can't think why. We killed a fine dog fox up at Polwent after a trail around like a Leyland dance." "We missed him," said Mother. "We couldn't think where he was, too. My husband was just coming up to ask around for him." "They'll be doing the same thing for me, what?" said the squire. Then he unwrapped Adam from the horse blanket he was wrapped in, and gave him into Sarah's and Becca's arms, whistled at the terrier, and went out the door, leaving it open. They heard him mount his horse and ride off into the dark. Dad closed the door. Adam sat on the bench seat smelling of dogs and horses, and began to play back to them the sounds of the hunt until the sounds came fewer and fewer, and his eyes closed, and he seemed to be asleep. "That's the first time I ever saw that for sure," said Mother. "I reckoned he never slept. Now I know he can. But hush you all." Chapter 14. They saw Adam sleeping again once more, and that was a long time later. Now, after this day hunting, which Mother said was above his station in life, because only the gentry went hunting, He was his usual waking self whenever they saw him. He lay on his bench seat all night and most of each day, looking with his eyes and sometimes moving his hands to hold Sarah's or Becca's. Now and then, on a bright day, he would go to the door, and sometimes outside. If there was plenty of light in the sky, he went out, whether it was raining or not. Dad thought he might be blinded by something, or that the light of this world might be too much for him. "What world do you reckon he comes from, then?" said Mother, and Dad said there wasn't another world by what the rector said, but he'd heard different when he was a boy, and he had learned different when he was working in the tin mines. He believed in all sorts of worlds himself. One day he brought home the stump of an old candle from the church and put it under the pillow on the bench seat, because candles from St. Kieran Church, of all the churches in the country, were able to help people in pain. "He hasn't a toothache," said Mother. "That's what the candle is good for." Then she thought how much the boy was the pale color of the candle, and looked at Sarah and Becca. "I didn't know they were such a common red country color." "They am common country maids," said Dad. "Red against him, maybe, but fair against most. There's Danish blood in them somewhere." "'Tis ill health in the boy," said Mother. "He lies there all day and plays but a little, and I'm sure he is waking and watching the night through." "I've watched myself," said Dad. "I've had times of not sleeping, and there's little wonder he sits there by day too." The next time Janey Tragos came by, Mother asked her in and gave her money and asked her about the watching. Janey lifted the boy up and nursed him by the fire and felt his limbs and put a finger across his ribs, which showed like a stray dog's. "He be not good eating," she said. "He be not thriving. But, my dear, 'tis in him not to goody and not to prosper, for fairy folk cannot fatten this side of the ground where he comes from. 'Tis not his place here among men, treat him how you will. When he first came among us, I said 'twould be a year and a day, no more, that he would be with us, and that's what you see here. He am readying to go back come summer. There be naught us folk can do, unless you can bring him a meal prieve to put in the room with him." Janey had her cup of tea, put on her sack again like a hood, and went off on her journeys among people's houses, telling them her old wisdom. A milprieve is the magic stone with its tangle of snakes, not at all easy to find. Sarah and Becca thought they must find one at once, if they could, and went out in the wintry frosty afternoon with its cold wind from the sea, hoping to come across one. They were down by the sea, looking among the rocks. The water was scalding in its coldness, biting at their legs to the knee as they worked along the shore. There was nothing to be found in the shallow water where they had once looked before, on the day that the Foundling Hospital at St. Cregan had sent the boy back on a cart to this very spot. They had perhaps touched a milprieve that day too, but the air and the water had been warm, and the day bright. Now it was dark and cold, and Becca cried as she looked. They went deeper and deeper into the water until they were fully wading in the waves, going out with the tide and looking at every uncovered stone and turning it to see what it was like, and dipping down into the foam between waves to lift others that were not yet uncovered. They had to look then because the daylight was going and soon it would be dark. "We could bring a lantern later," said Sarah, but Becca could only sob in reply. Then she stopped sobbing, because she had come across a milprieve and stood with her hand on it while a returning wave washed right over her. She managed to call to Sarah, who looked around and could not see her until the wave had gone back. Sarah climbed back over the rocks and looked at the stone with her. It was certainly a milprieve, all made of knotted stone snakes, but it was wedged under another stone and close up against a rock. "We must get it out," said Sarah, and they both put their hands on it and tugged and twisted. A wave came up again over them both, and when it went, they were both spluttering like drowned things, because they had not been ready for it and had breathed the salt in. The retreating water took away cold blood from their torn hands. "We can do it," said Sarah, and she was near to crying herself. Then, as they looked around to see what they could do, she thought she saw help. A trap went by on the road, with its candle lantern bright in the twilight, but it went past and was no good to them. Then it came back and stopped, and the driver jumped down and came across the sand and rocks. It was the squire, with his whip in his hand, coming to see what was going on. He stood on the peaks of the rocks, and the waves did not trouble him or seem to touch him. "Are you caught?" he said. "What is it?" "A milpreve for Adam," said Sarah. "Janie Turgot said he needed one, but it won't come and it cuts our hands." The squire waited for a wave to go back, put down his hand and pulled the milpreve out. "Janie knows," he said. "There are things the rector and I don't know, and she does." He carried the milpreve up to the trap, and they anxiously thought he was going to drive off with it when he put it in and climbed up himself. "Get in, what?" he said. "I'm passing your cottage." And they went cold through the cold wind to bring the wet milpreve to Adam and lay it on the bench seat beside him. Chapter 15. The milpreve was a better present than all Adam had at Christmas. He liked it, he looked at it, and he touched it with his hands and with his feet. He would lie against the fire, nestling it, listening to it, but never repeating anything it said, because it said nothing. One day the milpreve stood on the fender for a long time and became warmed through. When it was given to him on the bench seat, he put his hands and feet on it and felt the hotness. After that, Mother would warm it for him each night and give it to him in the hope that it would make him sleep or close his eyes at least. But nothing did that again at that time. The winter finished. Spring came, and with the spring the new birds flying from other places. By now, though, Adam was not hearing far-off sounds so much, and he did not call back as he had done in the last summer to every passing bird. With the coming of warmer weather, the fire was not always lit, and if it was, then it had died away by nightfall. Adam missed his warm milpreve. He did not seem to know what had made it warm, but would sit touching it and waiting for it to change magically, and usually it did not. Sometimes a tear would run from his eyes, and sometimes he would call out for Sarah or Becca. "He's cold through," said Sarah, one day when the faint mew of the gull sound of her name had come from him. "I shall take him in my bed between me and Becca." "Between me and Sari," said Becca, as if it were something different. "He can watch us all night," said Sarah, and indeed someone had to, because the bed was so narrow. The first night Sarah fell out of it from sleeping on the edge, and he called to her to come back, and Mother came to see what the trouble was. Sarah was sitting on the floor, crying from hitting her head on a box. The next night Sarah kept farther in, and Becca went down to sleep on the bench seat. The third night the milpreve went flying out of the bed and down the stairs, and everyone woke up. But after that they came up closer together. "It changes one noise for another, that's all," said Mother. "With him between you, you two little maids don't wrestle so much." But no one said what they all knew. No one liked to speak of the way Adam grew weaker and less interested in what was going on around him. Other people said it among themselves, perhaps, and each week there would be a small gift of delicious food for him, 2 eggs, or a small flat fish, or pink crab meat, or a first growing of fine salad leaves, or new herbs with healing powers. The largest gift was unexpected. One day Dad went off to work at the beginning of daylight. As he went, he shouted a greeting to someone who did not reply. The family in the house heard him mutter to himself as he walked off, and knew he was offended at being ignored. When they looked out much later, they were surprised to see a boat out in the estuary, as close to the shore as it could come. A small raft had come across from it to the shore, and on the shore there was the Saracen captain, and with him his large wife. They walked across the road and came up to the house, and no one in it had any time to say anything. The girls ran upstairs to Adam, and Mother began putting things tidy in the kitchen, because it was plain from the way the Saracens were coming that they were visiting and not merely asking the way. When they came up to the door, she opened it for them. The captain opened his black beard and smiled. His wife shook and laughed. They were going to come in, Mother found. She was nervous about that, and called the girls to come down, sharply. They came down with Adam and the milpreve and stood at the bottom of the stairs. "Naranha," said the Saracen lady, giggling. "For holy boy." And she lifted up a net of round gold fruit and put it into Mother's astonished arms. The smell made her sneeze. She had not often seen oranges. "You keep," said the Saracen lady. "I see, holy boy." And she walked across the room to the 3 children. The girls tried to climb the stairs backward, but there was no room for both of them, and they stuck. The Saracen lady touched the boy's hand and gave a shy, small shriek of delight and looked around to see whether she had been too daring. The captain said something gruff to her. Adam repeated the shriek and then as much as he could of the gruff remark. "He asked for it," said the Saracen lady. She felt in her sleeve and brought something out and put it in Adam's hand. The hand hardly held it. Sarah put up her own to keep the fingers closed. The thing they were holding was a large silver coin. The Saracen lady went back to her husband. "Many people tell of him," she said, crossing her hands on her large bosom and sighing seriously. Then she stopped being serious and smiled again and shook with humor. She pointed at Becca. "How many pound for small lady slave?" she asked. "£2 many shilling?" But she did not mean it, and Mother was able to laugh with her. The captain and his wife went backward down the path, both smiling, leaving Mother still astonished with the bright oranges. The Saracens crossed the road, went down to the raft and got on the tiny raft, which astonished Mother much more, and paddled their way back to the boat and climbed on it as it shook and wobbled under their weight. Then between them they put up the strange square sail and went away down the water. Janey Tregoze was soon along to see what had happened, and whether Becca had been sold this time, and to look at the oranges and the silver coin. "'Tis strange fruits and strange silver for him," she said, "but 'twill never hold him on this side of the world." "Will he die?" said Sarah, which was what she had been thinking, like the others. "In a year and a day, like you said?" "That I never said," said Janey. "He am fairy folk, and they am not mortal, and mortal means bound to die. So he cannot die. But I say he will not be among us longer than a few weeks more. A year and a day they stay. These pigsy children abide among us, and then back to their own folk, and blessings on those that kept them." Chapter 16. Summer came. Adam seemed to like to be out in the garden, lying in a place where rough grass grew, like the place where Sarah had found him by the bougie. Here he would sit up and listen, but say nothing until he wanted to be in the house again, and then he would call quietly like a gull or like a blackbird. Sarah went to him many times when a gull cried in the sky. Becca had to learn all the blackbirds that lived near, and then she could tell which was boy and which a real bird. He would drink the juice of the oranges. The girls ate the skins and the pulp that remained after the juice was crushed out. The oranges stayed in their net and dried until they were full of juice but had wrinkled, dry skins that could no longer be chewed. Sarah asked often to know when the middle of summer would be. It was a month away, and then 3 weeks, and then a fortnight. By then the sun had warmed the boy's skin and driven the waxiness away from it. Sarah said he looked better from sleeping with her and Becca. Always the milpreaves stayed with him, by his hand or his foot, and the surface of it began to shine with being handled so much. Midsummer was a week away when Sarah asked again. "Janey Tregoze may not know all things," said Mother, "and the boy looks well and does not seem so sad as he was in the winter." "I do not think he will go away," said Sarah. "Where could he go? He will be always with us." "He is ours, not yours," said Becca, making sure that nothing Mother or Janey Tregoze said would do anything to Adam. "You said we could keep him, and we found him." But Sarah counted out the week that followed, day by day, because Janey Tregoze had said a year and a day, and Mother believed Janey in so many things. The week went by, all full of sunshine and quietness, the tides rising and falling calmly in the estuary, the fields beyond it being cut for hay one by one, morning by morning, and changing color so that with the afternoon sun on them, they were as bright as new cloth. The gulls were far out to sea. Dust rose from the roads as carts and traps went by, and there was no darkness. Sarah found she was waking gently in the night and looking into Becca's eyes, watching and waking too, shining across the pillow at her and at Adam's eyes, with the window framed small in reflection in them, so that she could see what he could see. And they would all lie quiet together, and she would wonder whether by looking deeply for a long time she could find what he was thinking. But she could never get past the window of this world into that other. Midsummer Eve came, and close upon it, with a mere shadow of night between them, the day of midsummer. She had thought she saw its dawn in Adam's eyes. All that day they stayed with him, and held his hands if it seemed comfortable for him, and took him up to bed again in the late coming darkness. Sarah woke to some birds calling at the beginning of the day. Becca was awake too, and had moved to look at Adam, as if he had called her. She did not know whether he had or not. The girls looked at each other and decided he had not called them, because his eyes were closed for the second time that they had seen. When they woke again, his eyes were still closed, and they left him to that sleep with his millpreave in his hands, while they had breakfast and saw Dad go off to the clay pits. Then they went up to Adam again. Mother found them later on, when she had wondered where they were, in bed again, holding Adam close. "He sleeps cold," said Sarah. "Yes, indeed," said Mother, sitting on the bed and taking Adam's cold hand in hers. "He is sleeping cold." The tears ran down her cheeks. "I knew it must be so," she said. "Why are you crying?" said Sarah. "And what must be so?" "You cannot warm him," said Mother. "He has died." "No," said Sarah. "No. Janey said he was not one that would die." "He has only gone back to the fairies," said Becca, "and this part of him is still here. Janey said he would not die." "Stay here, then," said Mother, "and I will go to see the rector, because men will say this boy is dead and must be buried." So the girls stayed with him for a little while longer to keep him warm, and only wept a little when he was taken away from them by Dad, who came home from his work. "A year and a day," he said. "'Tis as the promise was." "Take him carefully," said Sarah, "and his millpreave with him." And she laid it in the small box that he was to be buried in. He was buried the next day under the grass outside the church. Sarah and Becca sat on the grass beside the grave and listened to the rector as he said words. The squire was there and carried the box with Dad, and between them they put it down in the ground. And the rector said quite clearly that people only appear to die, but still live. Then everybody else went away, and the girls were quiet with Adam once more, until Dad came back with a shovel and told them to go home because Adam was resting forever and had to be covered. The girls did not go straight home, but went up the lane and to the bougie, where they had found him a year before. They were not unhappy at all, and they did not expect to find him again either. They knew that he was with them still in some way, and they went up in silence until they quarreled about which clump of grass was the right one. So they came home again. "It is the first whole year I remember," said Sarah. "We are a year older now." "A year and a day," said Becca. Chapter 17. The cries of birds now would bring Sarah and Becca out of the house, looking to see who had summoned them. "You am bound to be disappointed," said Mother one day, holding them for a moment in the doorway. "'Tisn't likely to be him." "Sometimes it is," said Becca. "One was yesterday, just in among the black currants." "Ah," said Mother, "that was the currants calling Rebecca as much as anything. I saw where they'd been kissing your lips before they found your tongue." "I ate them for him," said Becca. It was not a story she had made up. She had truly felt that she was feeding the boy, and truly remembering the time last year when they had first been together. Janey Tregose came in one day. "I said he must go, my dears," she said. "I hope it isn't too heartbreaking for you little maids." Mother said that they hadn't properly noticed yet, but that one day they would. "Time will mend that," said Janey. "He'll go from them more." "He will never go," said Sarah. "We know where he is." "Lost men's," said Mother, "but they're ever a patch showing." "This one will mend sooner than they think," said Janey. "In a matter of some days, I reckon." "I reckon," said Mother. Then she and Janey settled down to a proper gossip, and the girls went out of the house and up to the churchyard. Here they looked at the 3 squares of turf that Dad had replaced over the grave, and thought of the sleeping boy and his milpreeve. Then they played a long game among the standing stones, taking turns to be Adam and be found, until the rector came walking among the stones and frightened them over the wall and home again. As they went, they thought how the rector was part of their lives and part of the boy's stay with them. They stood in front of the rectory and remembered taking the boy there. "Not a parish boy," said Sarah. "Are you?" And she thought a seagull might have answered her. They went to St. Craigan Market one day and looked down the street where the Foundling Hospital was. They could not bear to go near, because all 3 of them, Sarah, Becca, and Mother, felt ashamed of having gone near the first time, and of having thought for a moment of leaving anyone there in that dirty, unkind place. "'Twas not charitable to think of that as charity," said Mother. "Rector have never been here, or he would know. I don't know we did so much for him, but at least 'twas not mean, though we am poor." On the walk home, they all began to feel it was that other day over again, and the memory of their sad unkindness made them unhappy. They stopped again by the sea, where they had stopped before, where Sarah and Becca had gone for the milpreeve. Mother said she would have liked to go straight on, but she was weary and had to rest. The girls dabbled in the sea and waited with a sort of hope that the bugling shouts of the gulls were going to turn into the return of the boy on the Foundling Hospital's handcart. But in their waiting, no one came along the road. They went home alone. "I feel as if I'd left him," said Mother. "He hasn't left us," said Sarah. But she was struggling along the road with a heavy basket that nipped her fingers with its wicker handle, and what she would have most welcomed was the squire with his trap. "What?" she said to herself, remembering him and how he was part of their lives too, with the boy, like the rector and the sea. She walked on, feeling that the basket might be full of magical milpreaves instead of market goods. They truly remembered the milpreave on a special journey back to that piece of sea, on a rainy day when they decided it was the birthday of that expedition, and they had been put out of the house early because Janey Tregose was coming for the whole day. They wanted to find another milpreave in any case, because Janey, coming the day before, had told them they were to get back more than they had lost. Sarah had said that they had lost nothing, but when she said it, she began to realize that they had truly lost Adam, and that he had perhaps gone away more than she knew. On their way back without a milpreave, but with dry feet because they had not looked very hard, they met Dad, who was looking for them. "Have the clay pits closed?" said Sarah, because this was a working time of day. "I came out on a holiday," said Dad, "but they don't want us at the house for a while." He did not say why. Instead, he took them around the harbor, where they looked at the boats and remembered the Saracen captain and his wife, and looked in the empty fish boxes. Then, as the fishing boats came back, they went home in the drizzle that had fallen all day, to a candle-lit house, all 3 very hungry. In the house there was Janey Tregose, sitting at the table with the teapot like an owner, and Mother lying on the bench seat, and on the floor by the fire a long basket with something that moved in it. "What be the way of it?" said Dad. "Man or maid?" "A fine boy," said Janey Tregose. "Born about 6 o'clock by the church bell." Then, about 10 days later, they were all at church, except Janey, who never went. Mother was carrying the fine boy who howled, but not in any way like a clarinet, as their other boy had done. This time, again, the rector came to them in the middle of the service and led them to the font. This was another christening, and it was like the boys again, but this time it was real, and the other one an earlier remembrance. The manager of the clay pit was a godfather, and a neighbor was a godmother, and the second godfather was the squire, and possibly his dog as well, because it was in his arms. And the boy was baptized and christened Adam, and he yelled right across the church and had to be taken out afterward, when he too was a holy Christian man. And Sarah and Rebekah sat by the side of the road and cried with happiness, while the church of people sang. And Adam listened with them.